Ukraine now has the single largest army in Europe outside Russia. And because of the 3 years of war, it is the most experienced and battle-hardened army. So the Ukrainians will have a very much greater capability in 3-4 years' time to resist any new Russian invasion, particularly if they have the additional support of European countries in the background.
Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said this morning that any deployment of European peacekeepers to Ukraine would be interpreted by Moscow as an open military attack by NATO. Well, that would seem to kill the Starmer-Macron peace initiative at birth. Let's go through this and many other things with Malcolm Rifkind. Served as both Foreign Secretary and Defence Secretary in Conservative governments. Malcolm Rifkind, I mean, the whole European peacekeeping plan does collapse, does it not, if that is the settled will of the Kremlin?
Well, I think it was always known that that is what Lavrov and Putin would strongly oppose for the reasons that they have stated, that Britain and France are, of course, are NATO member states. But I have to confess to a personal, very strong reservation about the whole idea myself, not for that reason, but for something equally important. The suggestion is that there would be a few thousand British or French troops. Now, in the event of Russia breaking the ceasefire and invading, what is to be the role of these British and French and other European troops? Are they going to be in combat with invading Russian forces? If that is so, the idea of 3,000 or 4,000 is absurd, given the numbers that would be involved on the Russian side. But is it also something that is part of your British and French government policy? Because if they're simply going to be, as it were, peacekeepers, like UN troops, who try to persuade the other side not to invade, then they don't really need to be British or French. If they have no combat role, then it's a pretty symbolic exercise. If they would have a combat role, then you need tens of thousands, not 3,000 or 4,000, and that is something which has not been contemplated up till now.
Well, you raise some scrutiny that this whole plan has not so far been given, so I thank you for that. Let me broaden it out a little bit. Do you fear that we are in the dying days of a US-led NATO?
Well, if we are, it's because Trump wants it that way. Certainly no European countries want that. And I suspect the vast majority of Americans don't either. But the problem with Trump, it's difficult to tell whether what he's been doing is part of a coherent strategy or whether it's simply a series of spasms and responses to particular gut feelings he has. Because what you were saying to your earlier guest is quite true. There has not been a single statement by Trump which gives confidence that he would actually, in a negotiation on behalf of Ukraine, that he would demand concessions from the Russians. You know, when you're going to reach something, particularly a ceasefire, it's meant to be a basis of compromise by both sides. What are meant to be the compromises that the United States expects from Russia? Now, Trump may be super clever. He may have all these things up his sleeve, but chooses for the time being to seem to agree with everything Putin says and does, and to be hostile to everything that Ukraine does. It's a pretty odd and unprecedented way of trying to achieve a diplomatic peace, which is something we all do want, including, I suspect, Donald Trump. So I'm not saying he's deliberately deceiving people. I think there's just an incoherence in the policy that doesn't add up.
Well, odd indeed is the right way to put it. Now, Keir Starmer still says America's a reliable ally. I understand why he's saying that, and he's right to say that at the moment. President Macron said on television last night that although he hopes that's the case too, that we, Europe, must now plan for a world in which we can no longer depend on America. I suspect that the way ahead, we need to take notice of what President Macron said, that we need to do this regardless of whether America's still a reliable ally or not.
Well, I think I go along with that broadly. I think my own view, as it's evolving, and one has to keep trying to keep up with changing events, but my own view is not that President Trump is actively hostile to Ukraine. He may be hostile to Zelensky as a person, but not to Ukraine as a country. I think he's, in a sense, it's almost worse than that. He's indifferent. He actually doesn't care much what happens in Ukraine and whether Ukraine is independent or part of controlled by Russia or not, because his main target, I believe, is first of all to reestablish that the great superpowers, by which he means himself, Xi Jinping, inevitably Putin, although Russia is a very declining power, it still has massive numbers of nuclear weapons and it's got this huge Eurasian landmass, that they are the people who should meet and try and sort out some of the world's problems. Now, in a limited sense, I don't have a difficulty with a resumed dialogue with Putin. For example, if that meant that America and Russia, for the first time for a good number of years, were able to get into serious discussions about arms control of nuclear weapons, strategic control, as we used to do in the past, that would actually be a positive move. But in terms of what is the role of NATO, which was your original question to me, the concern has to be that if Trump is not so much hostile, but is indifferent, because of China and for other reasons, then Europe has to fill the gap. Now, that's not a bad thing. The defense of Europe should be primarily by European countries. I've always believed that. And the objective was, how do you get European countries, of which Britain was one of the least offenders, but still not spending enough, to so ramp up their defense expenditure that Europe, which has, 10 times the GDP of Russia,
Indeed.
Has a total population far greater than Russia, has more weapons than Russia has, apart from nuclear weapons. This is not something which is unreasonable for the rest of the world to say, well, yes, Ukraine's part of Europe. NATO is involved with European defense. It should be European countries assisted by the United States, not led by the United States, who have the prime responsibility. I don't have a problem with that.
I understand. If Mr. Trump continues on his current trajectory, he's called Zelensky a dictator. Did
he say that? I don't remember. I'm kind of afraid.
No, his memory, I remember, though he might not, but I remember.
Yeah.
And of course, we have it on tape. He has called on elections in Ukraine, which of course is a difficult thing to have at time as war. As we found out in the Second World War, we didn't have them either. And this morning we learn a remarkable, almost petty development, that there are talk of revoking the temporary legal status of 240,000 Ukrainian refugees in America. When you add all that up and more, should we think again about that state visit?
Yeah, well, no, I don't think we should, because state visits are not just meant to be a spasmodic response to a particular moment in time. But on the broader issue, I mean, I think this story that's coming out about the Ukrainians who live in America, this seems to be part of the broad policy which Trump is pursuing at the moment of revoking permission for all those who do not have lawful permission to remain in the United States. And it includes large numbers of Latin Americans and from other countries. So I think he may not have yet exempted Ukraine, and he may not want to do so. That we just don't know with Trump. But I think that is in a sense a side issue, although that might sound a curious thing to say.
Finally, if Europe is now having to do much more of the heavy lifting when it comes to defence, which I think it is going to do now, and there is general agreement of that, how does it go about doing that? Does it do it primarily as the European Union? Does it do it by reconfiguring a NATO without America? Does it do it with a coalition of the willing nation states who spend a lot on defence? And where would Brexit Britain fit in any of that?
Well, all these various organizations must be part of this, but France and Germany and other European countries that are part of the European Union have already said what Britain also agrees, that on the question of defense and national security, the United Kingdom, regardless of Brexit, is as valuable in many respects, and even more valuable contributor to the defense and national security of Europe, and they are proceeding on that basis. So that issue has been resolved. Brexit is not going to make any difference to this one way or another, nor should it. But it is good that the European Union is itself, as an organization, in common with France and the United Kingdom nationally, is proposing to try to ease its own financial rules so it can also make a very major contribution collectively on behalf of its members to a defense expenditure. And remember also that in one sense, Trump has done us perhaps an unplanned favor, because we all know that the real problem is not that Russia is going to attack the Baltic states or Europe in the next 6 months, 12 months, or a year. It is that if there is a peace in Ukraine, then in 2 or 3 years' time, 3 or 4 years' time, if Putin feels emboldened, that's the time he might wish to attack what are member states of NATO, particularly the Baltic states. Now, we could not deal with that, Europe alone, if that was to happen tomorrow. Thanks to Mr. Trump, unintentionally, but nevertheless, this is the consequence. We now have 2 or 3 years, which is roughly the period of time you would require with the additional resources that are going to be spent, to actually revamp not only the size of, for example, the British Army, for the revamp the equipment that is required, the ammunition that is required. And remember also at the same time, the Ukrainians already produce something like 50 to 60% of their equipment requirement, military equipment requirements. Because in Soviet days, Ukraine provided a third of all the weapons the Soviet Union manufactured. So the Ukrainians over the next 3 years, with or without a ceasefire, are going to ramp that up themselves so that their own contribution to their military equipment will be nearer 70, 80% than seemed remotely likely a few years ago. Ukraine now has the single largest army in Europe outside Russia. And because of the 3 years of war, it is the most experienced and battle-hardened army. So the Ukrainians will have a very much greater capability in 3 or 4 years' time to resist any new Russian invasion, particularly if they have the additional support of European countries in the background, if that was to happen. And that is something that I'm not exaggerating, but it doesn't mean the whole world will be perfect. But it'll be a different world in terms of Europe's capabilities for its own defense and to defend indirectly Ukraine.
Malcolm Rifkind, thank you for coming on to Times Radio. It's been good to talk to you. I hope you'll come back as this develops, as undoubtedly it will. That was Malcolm Rifkind there giving us his expertise as a former Defence and Foreign Secretary for the United Kingdom.